I should tell you from the beginning that my brother had no intention of being caught. He had spent 3 years abroad for the express purpose of avoiding exactly this. The September gatherings at Caldenver, the endless parade of suitable young women our grandmother arranged with the precision of a military campaign, the pointed looks over the dinner table, the walks that were never accidentally assembled. Edmund, the most feared Duke of Caldenver, had learned long ago that the only way to resist Lady Weston was to put the channel between them. He returned in the autumn of that year only because our mother was unwell, and he returned already making plans to leave again by Christmas. He had not counted on Mrs. Arden. None of us had really, that was rather the point. She arrived 3 days before Edmund did, and I confess I thought nothing of her at first. She was our grandmother's new companion for the season, the widow of Mr. Arden, a young solicitor's clerk from the western counties whose debts had outlasted him by some considerable margin. She was perhaps 24, perhaps 25. It was difficult to say with any precision because she carried herself with a steadiness that made the question feel irrelevant. She had dark brown hair and gray eyes of an unusual clarity, and she wore the kind of plain, well-made gowns that suggested a woman who had made her peace with limited means and refused to be diminished by them. She spoke when she had something to say. She listened in a way that made you feel heard. She helped our grandmother with the household accounts without being asked, organized the correspondence in 3 days when the previous arrangement had resisted organization for a decade, and was quietly certain of her opinions in a way that made her neither aggressive nor deferential, but simply unmistakably present. I liked her immediately, which in my experience is the best indication that she would confound my brother entirely. I should tell you something about Edmund for context. He is, as the title suggests, a man of considerable consequence and considerable restraint. He has the sort of presence that quiets rooms and the sort of mind that rarely encounters anything it cannot dispatch efficiently. He was good to his tenants, fair to his staff, and completely insufferable to his grandmother, who was the only person on earth who did not appear to be intimidated by him in the slightest. He had refused 6 perfectly eligible matches in 2 seasons not out of cruelty, but because none of them had offered him anything he had not already. He was, in short, a man who had everything and was still, quietly, waiting for something he could not name. Our grandmother had named it years ago. She had simply been waiting for the right occasion to arrive at Caldenver wearing a plain blue gown and asking to help with the correspondence. "Who is she?" Edmund asked the evening he arrived, not half an hour after greeting our grandmother with the careful cordiality of a man who knows he is walking into a campaign. "My companion," our grandmother said with the mildest possible expression. "Mrs. Arden, a perfectly respectable widow. She has come to help me manage the correspondence." Edmund looked at me. I looked at the ceiling. "She is not," he said very quietly, "another scheme." "Edmund," our grandmother set down her embroidery, "you are 37 years old. You have refused 6 perfectly eligible young women in the past 2 seasons alone. I have simply invited a companion to help with the correspondence. Do you object to widows managing correspondence?" Edmund said nothing. That silence, in my experience, meant he had already noticed something he didn't wish to examine too closely. She was not, for the record, seated at dinner that first evening. She took her meals with the household staff by her own preference, a fact our grandmother mentioned casually, and which Edmund did not appear to find relieving. He spent the meal asking questions about the estate's northern acreage with slightly too much concentration, and I watched him and thought, "Oh, this is going to be magnificent." The walled garden was where it began in earnest. Our grandmother had taken to walking the south garden each morning for her health, and Mrs. Arden accompanied her. Edmund had taken to walking the same garden because he maintained it settled his mind before the morning's correspondence, a claim I found unconvincing but did not challenge. The first morning they coincided, Mrs. Arden stepped back from the gate to allow the Duke to pass and said, "Good morning, Your Grace," with the kind of courtesy that indicated she had no particular interest in anything further. Edmund nodded. He walked the full length of the garden without glancing back. Our grandmother watched from the stone bench with the serene expression of a woman playing a very long game. The second morning they coincided again. Mrs. Arden was kneeling beside the late-season roses with a small pair of clippers, helping the gardener, and she had a smudge of earth on her left wrist. She looked up when Edmund's shadow fell across her, said, "Your Grace," and returned to what she was doing. Edmund stood there for a moment. This I witnessed from the upper terrace, and I want to be precise. And then he said, "You need not stop on my account." "I hadn't planned to," she said pleasantly. He walked 3 more steps, stopped, and said without turning, "The outer roses want cutting back further. The stems are crossing." There was a pause. "Thank you," she said. "You're right." He walked on, but he walked more slowly than usual. I told our grandmother at breakfast that things were proceeding beautifully, and she pressed her lips together in the effort of not smiling. The dinner was our grandmother's second move, and it was deftly done. She invited the local vicar and his wife for a small family supper. Not a party, nothing that Edmund could object to, and she mentioned, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, that it would be rather odd to have Mrs. Arden eating alone in her room when they were such a small gathering. Edmund looked at the table settings. He said nothing. Mrs. Arden arrived in a dark blue gown and took the chair that had been left for her, which happened to be directly across from Edmund's. They spoke of the estate's renovation of the old mill. This sounds unremarkable. It was not. I watched my brother, who is in all public settings the most composed man in any room, ask Mrs. Arden a question about the millwork, something to do with the structural timber she had apparently been reading about, since our grandmother had left a pamphlet about it somewhere accessible, and then actually listened to her answer. Not the listening of a man waiting his turn to speak. The listening of a man who has been surprised. "You've read Hargreaves' report," Edmund said. "Your grandmother has a copy in the library," Mrs. Arden said. "I found it interesting. The approach to the lintels is unconventional." "It is," he said. "It works, though. We tried the traditional method on the east wing and had to redo it within a year." "That would be the load distribution," she said. Edmund looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." The vicar's wife caught my eye across the table with the delighted expression of a woman who has just witnessed something unexpected, and I made a private resolve to be nowhere near Edmund when he eventually worked out what had happened to him. The charade game was our grandmother's masterpiece. She proposed it on the Thursday evening when the rain had driven everyone indoors, and the usual entertainments, a walk, a ride, a prolonged discussion of the North Acreage, were unavailable. Edmund, who had endured charade games at Caldenver since childhood and knew exactly how they were arranged, pointed out that the numbers were uneven. "Not at all," our grandmother said serenely. "Mrs. Arden will partner with Edmund. I shall partner with your cousin, and the vicar's wife has brought her sister." "Mrs. Arden is your companion," Edmund said. "She needn't be pressed into." "I don't mind at all," Mrs. Arden said, from behind the copy of the estate records she'd been quietly reviewing. She set it down and looked at him with the same mild composure she brought to everything. "Unless you object, Your Grace." Edmund could not, without being ungracious, say that he objected. He said nothing. He sat down in the chair opposite hers. They won comprehensively. This was not my grandmother's scheme. It was simply what happened when you put 2 people with quick minds and steady nerves on the same side of a table. Edmund guessed 3 of her signals on gestures so small I could barely see them. She worked out 2 of his before he'd finished the first movement. At the end of the 3rd round, our grandmother declared them winners with the expression of a woman watching a horse race she'd wagered heavily on. Afterwards, when our grandmother had retired and the candles were burning low, Edmund poured himself a glass of port and sat in the window seat and said to me, very quietly, "Don't." "I haven't said anything," I said. "You've been thinking loudly all evening." "I was only going to observe," I said, "that you appear to be enjoying yourself." Edmund drank his port. He looked at the window, which reflected the room back at us in amber and shadow. "She is a well-read woman," he said, "who can hold a conversation and does not require managing. That is a rare enough quality that I find it." "Enjoyable," I offered. He gave me the look he usually reserved for tenants who had pushed their luck. "Restful," he said. "I find it restful." "Of course," I said, "entirely restful." He was quiet for a moment, turning the glass slowly. Edmund rarely fidgets. It is one of the things that makes him formidable, but he turned that glass 3 times in his hand before he set it down. "She guessed my signal in the 3rd round," he said. "The one about the Caldenver coat of arms. I'd given it as a gesture so small I wasn't sure I'd made it at all." "I know," I said. "I saw." "Nobody ever," he stopped. He picked up the glass again. "I have played these games since I was a child," he said, and nobody has ever caught that one." He said this with the particular careful tone of a man trying to convey something without quite saying it. I let the silence run. "She is," he said finally. "Very," he stopped again. "She is observant," he finished, and drank his port with the expression of a man who knows perfectly well that is not what he meant. "Of course," I said. "Good night, Edmund." I found our grandmother in the corridor outside, which meant she had been listening, which surprised no one. "How is it going?" she asked. "He called her restful," I said. And then he told me she noticed a signal in the charade game that no one has ever noticed before, in a tone of voice I have not previously associated with estate management. Our grandmother smiled then fully in the way she only did when she was certain she had won. "That's what your grandfather called me," she said. "Right before he proposed, restful." She said the word with such rich satisfaction that it barely resembled a compliment anymore. The highest thing a man like that can say. The week that followed was, from my vantage point, one of the more remarkable things I have ever watched unfold. Edmund did not seek Mrs. Arden out deliberately, or rather, he did not admit to himself that he was doing so, which is a distinction that matters only to the person making it. He happened to be in the library at the same hour. She returned a stack of pamphlets. He happened to ask about the letter she was transcribing for our grandmother, which turned into a 20-minute discussion of the estate's charity provisions, and then somehow extended into a disagreement about the most efficient method for distributing the winter coal allowance to the tenants. A disagreement she won, decisively, with 3 citations from the estate's own records, and a quiet patience that suggested she had looked them up specifically for this purpose. He happened to be passing through the East Hall when she was struggling with a window latch, and he fixed it with 3 efficient movements, and then stood there rather longer than the task required, discussing the quality of the ironwork, which dated to his grandfather's time. I catalogued all of this with the attention of a man who had nothing better to do, and a great deal of personal investment in the outcome. He asked about her husband once. I was not present, but our grandmother told me. They had been in the library. This had become their unclaimed territory, the hours between morning correspondence and the afternoon's calls, and Edmund had asked, in the careful way he asked things that mattered, what Mr. Arden had been like. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said that he had been kind but young, and that they had married too quickly for either of them to know what they were doing, and that she thought kindly of him without pretending to a grief she no longer felt. Edmund said nothing for a moment, and then said that he was sorry she had been left in difficult circumstances. She said the circumstances were not so difficult now. Then, apparently, they returned to the estate records. Our grandmother related this to me with an expression that could only be described as serene triumph. Mrs. Arden, for her part, was neither encouraging nor discouraging in a way that I found quietly admirable. She was simply herself, composed, clear-eyed, possessed of opinions she stated without drama, and humor she deployed without vanity. When Edmund said something pompous, which he occasionally did from long habit, she let a beat of silence pass that was just long enough to suggest she had noticed. When he said something genuinely good, she said yes, with a straightforwardness that made it clear she was not flattering him. He was, I could see, rather unused to this. Most people agreed with Edmund because he was the Duke of Caldenver, and because his jaw had a quality that discouraged disagreement. Mrs. Arden appeared to be unaware that the jaw was doing anything at all. She corrected him once on a matter of estate boundary law, gently, with evidence, the way a woman does who is used to being disbelieved and has learned to come prepared. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You are right," with the deliberate simplicity of a man who is not accustomed to saying those words in that order and is doing so on purpose. She looked at him with a measured surprise she quickly composed, and something in that moment, the care with which he said it, the care with which she received it, seemed to change the temperature of the room very slightly, in a way I do not have better language for. I asked her once, when I came upon her in the garden and we fell into easy company, whether she found the household strange after a quieter life. "Not strange," she said. "Generous. Your grandmother is very kind." She paused, though she has a rather definite sense of how things should proceed. "She does," I agreed. "She arranged the seating at dinner last Thursday so that your brother and I would discuss the mill restoration." Mrs. Arden said this without accusation, only with the mild clarity I'd come to expect from her. I noticed. I looked at her. "Did you mind?" She considered this with genuine thoughtfulness. "No," she said, "it was a good conversation." She looked back at the roses. "I don't often have good conversations." "Edmund doesn't either," I said, "though he would be very annoyed if I told you that." She smiled then, a small, quiet thing contained the way everything about her was contained. "I suspected as much," she said. "I thought about that for a long time afterwards." There is a particular loneliness that attaches itself to capable people in positions of authority, where the people around them perform deference and call it companionship. Edmund had lived that way for years and called it the natural condition of the dukedom. Mrs. Arden had lived that way because she was a widow of insufficient means in a world that had very little time for either. They had arrived at the same isolated place from entirely different directions, and our grandmother, whatever else you might say about her methods, had seen that clearly. Edmund's resistance collapsed not dramatically, but by degrees, the way frost gives way in early spring, not a crack, but a slow, irreversible softening that you notice only when you look back and realize the ground has changed. He stopped making plans to leave by Christmas. He stopped mentioning London. He appeared at breakfast with a regularity that was unlike him, and sat at the end of the table in a position that happened to give him a clear view of the chair where Mrs. Arden sat reviewing the morning's correspondence. I watched him read a letter one morning while she was absorbed in the household accounts. He was not reading it. His eyes were on the page and his attention was entirely elsewhere. When she looked up and asked him a question about the coal merchant's invoice, she was methodical about the household accounts and had found a discrepancy that annoyed her. He answered it without hesitation, correctly, and then returned to his letter. A man who was not paying attention cannot answer a question like that. He had been listening to everything. There was an afternoon, perhaps 2 weeks into the scheme's second act, when the weather broke briefly and the light came through the library windows at the particular angle it achieves in late autumn, turning everything amber and still. I came to retrieve a book and found them at the table in silence, not the silence of two people who have nothing to say but the rarer kind, of two people who are comfortable enough not to need words to fill the space. Mrs. Arden was writing. Edmund was reviewing a map of the eastern tenancies. The fire was going. It looked, without any particular effort on either of their parts, like a life. I backed out of the room quietly and told our grandmother, who said only, "Yes, I know," in the tone of a woman who has been waiting for exactly that. Our grandmother watched all of this with the patience of a woman who had been right about things for a very long time. The final gathering was a small afternoon party, a dozen or so of the county's families, nothing elaborate, the last such occasion before the winter closed in. It was, our grandmother informed me the morning before, the moment she intended to move from the opening game to the close. "She is not a piece on a board," I told her because I felt it ought to be said. "No," our grandmother agreed, "she is not, that is why this works." She folded her hands on the table. If she were anyone who could be moved, Edmund would already have grown bored and left the country again. The fact that he has not, the fact that he has been here for 6 weeks and is not miserable, means this is already real. I am simply making sure he says so before he talks himself back out of it. The afternoon party proceeded as such things do. Tea was poured, the county's family said the county's things, and Edmund moved through it all with the practiced ease of a duke who had been making these movements since boyhood. I watched him. I watched him scan the room twice before he found her, where Mrs. Arden was seated with the vicar's wife near the windows, listening to something with her customary attention. When he found her, something in his posture settled very slightly. I do not think he knew he had been looking. I do not think he knew it had settled. Our grandmother chose her moment with precision. She rose from her chair and addressed the room in the way she had addressed rooms for 60 years, with a quiet authority that required no raising of her voice. "I must confess," she said, "that I have been somewhat disingenuous with you all." There was a polite rustle of attention. "I introduced Mrs. Arden to you at the beginning of the season as my companion. That is not entirely accurate. She is, in fact, my guest of honor, a woman of considerable mind and character whom I have been fortunate to know, and to whom Caldenver owes a rather better introduction than I gave her." The room looked at Mrs. Arden. She looked at our grandmother with an expression of composed surprise, and something that was, I watched carefully, not embarrassment but a kind of guarded stillness, as though she were waiting to see what this meant. "I have long believed," our grandmother continued, That the people we overlook are simply the people we have not yet bothered to see. She looked then at Edmund, not obviously, not in a way that the room would necessarily follow, but Edmund followed it. He was standing near the fireplace, and he went very still. "I hope," our grandmother finished, "that you will all have the opportunity to see Mrs. Arden rather more clearly from now on." She sat down. The room absorbed this with the uncertain good humor of guests who are not quite sure they've understood the occasion, and conversation resumed. Edmund did not resume conversation. He stood by the fireplace for a moment longer than was quite natural, and then he crossed the room, not to our grandmother, to the window where Mrs. Arden sat. I moved closer, because I am a devoted younger brother, and also because I had invested 6 weeks in this, and intended to hear it. He did not sit. He stood at a slight angle, which in the vocabulary of period manners meant he was speaking to her and not to the room, a distinction she would understand. "Mrs. Arden," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She looked up at him with those clear gray eyes that gave nothing away and everything away simultaneously. "My grandmother," he said, "has been conducting a campaign." "Yes," she said simply, "I know." "A beat you knew from the beginning." "I suspected. She is not subtle, though she believes she is." A pause, the smallest fraction of warmth in her voice. "I mean that with great affection." Edmund looked at her for a moment, and you stayed. It was not quite a question. She heard it as what it was, which was something closer to, "You could have left and you did not, and I want to understand why." "The conversations were good," she said. "The library is excellent, and your grandmother—" She stopped. She looked at the garden beyond the window. "No one has looked at me that directly in a very long time," she said. "As though I were worth looking at." The room was doing what rooms do, managing its own noise, its own conversations, its own oblivious pleasant business. Edmund and Mrs. Arden were a small island in it, and I was perhaps 10 feet away pretending to examine a painting I had seen 500 times. "She is not wrong," Edmund said. Mrs. Arden looked back at him. "In her assessment," he said, and then because he was Edmund and Edmund when he committed to something committed without flinching, "I have been trying to refuse you. I told myself it was because she arranged it, and I have spent 30 years resisting arrangements, but I find—" He stopped. He tried again. "I find that I have run entirely out of reasons." The party was still going on around them. The vicar was discussing something agricultural. Someone's daughter was playing the pianoforte in the far room, imperfectly but with great enthusiasm. Our grandmother was drinking her tea and looking out the window with the expression of a woman contemplating the gardens and absolutely nothing else. "Your Grace," Mrs. Arden said, and her voice was quiet and entirely steady, "are you telling me that your grandmother's scheme worked on you?" "Comprehensively," he said, "against my considerable resistance." Something shifted in her face then, not laughter, but the near cousin of it, the thing that lives just underneath. "She will be insufferable," Mrs. Arden said. "For decades," Edmund agreed. "I intend to let her be." There was a moment then that I will not pretend I fully understood from 10 feet away. But I saw her look at him with those clear eyes, and I saw him look back at her without the composure he used as armor, and I thought, there it is. The thing our grandmother had seen weeks before the rest of us. He did not make a declaration in the middle of the party. He was not that sort of man. He said, "May I call on you tomorrow morning? In the library, not at the grandmother's arrangement. Mine." "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without condition. He nodded. He stepped back into the party. He crossed to our grandmother and bent to say something near her ear. I could not hear it. I watched our grandmother's expression, which did not change at all, which meant it had cost her considerable effort to keep it composed. Later, I found her alone in the sitting room after the guests had gone, and I asked what he had said. He said, our grandmother told me, with the satisfaction of a woman who has waited a very long time for something and finds the wait was worth it, "Thank you." I called on them in the library the following morning. This was not strictly an intrusion, as Edmund had not said the library was private, only that it was his arrangement. And I found them at opposite ends of the great table with a stack of books between them and a conversation in progress that had clearly been running for some time. There was a piece of paper between them covered in Edmund's handwriting, and Mrs. Arden was pointing to something near the bottom of it with a directness that told me she disagreed with it and was explaining why. Edmund's expression was the one he wore when he had encountered a problem worth solving, which on Edmund looks very nearly like happiness. He looked up when I entered, assessed the situation, and said with perfect equanimity, "Get out, Thomas." I got out. But I came back 3 hours later because I have never in my life been able to resist knowing how a thing ends, and I found them still in the library, the books pushed to one side, the conversation clearly having moved through several territories and arrived somewhere quieter. Edmund had his hand resting on the table very close to hers without quite touching it, which in the vocabulary of the man I have known for 37 years was essentially equivalent to a declaration of permanent devotion. She was looking at something out the window, and he was looking at her, and neither of them appeared to be in any hurry. He asked her properly the following week. He told me afterwards, not because he was given to romantic confessions, but because he could not quite keep it to himself, which was in itself rather remarkable for Edmund. He had taken her to the walled garden in the morning, when the light was thin, and the last of the autumn roses were holding on against the cold, and he had told her what she had already begun to understand, that he had spent 37 years refusing to be maneuvered, and had found, in the end, that it was not the maneuvering he minded but the lack of a reason worth accepting. He had spent 6 weeks in this woman's company and found himself, against every expectation, a better version of himself in it, steadier, less armored, attending to things he had long stopped noticing. He had found the reason. He was not a man who let good reasons go. She said yes. She had apparently looked at him for a moment first with those gray eyes, steady and clear, assessing him with the same unhurried directness she brought to everything, and then said yes simply and without condition, not because she needed the dukedom or the estate or the social restitution, but because she had been paying attention to, and what she had seen was worth having. He told me that with a quietness that made it clear it was the part that mattered most to him, not that she said yes, but why she said it. Our grandmother, when informed, said, "I know," and returned to her embroidery. Though I noticed she set it down again almost immediately and sat for a long moment looking at the fire with a smile she had apparently forgotten to contain. I am telling you all this because Edmund would not. He is, as I mentioned, the most feared Duke of Caldenver, and feared dukes do not, as a rule, admit that they were carefully and lovingly outmaneuvered by their 80-year-old grandmother, and spent 6 weeks slowly and thoroughly losing their composure over a widow who smudged earth on her wrist from the garden roses and reads structural engineering reports for pleasure. But I watched it happen. Every morning in the walled garden, every dinner where he listened with that quality of attention he reserves for things that matter, every evening in the library where he stopped planning his departure and started planning his days around the quiet fact of her presence. She is, as of the following spring, the Duchess of Caldenver. Society found this strange. She was, after all, a solicitor's widow of no particular family and modest means, and the Duke of Caldenver is not a man one expects to defy convention. But Edmund has never in his life declined to do a thing simply because convention hadn't anticipated it, and he presented her to the county with a straightforward pride that made it very clear what he thought of anyone who found the match surprising. I stood beside our grandmother at the ceremony in the estate chapel, and watched my brother take Mrs. Arden's hand with the unhurried certainty of a man who has stopped refusing the best thing that ever happened to him. "You knew," I said to our grandmother. "Of course I knew," she said. "I simply gave them the garden, the library, and 6 weeks." She watched Edmund slide the ring onto the new Duchess's finger. "The rest was entirely theirs." That is the thing about a good scheme, I suppose. The best ones only work because they are true.